Hello, I'm Paul Briley, and you're listening to Off the Comma. I'm a human who cares about supporting other humans. On this podcast, we explore all facets of what it means to feel stuck in life. We talk with people just like us who found themselves sitting on a comma and not knowing where to go next. We'll unpack the experience with them, where they've been stuck, what it feels like, what they experienced, and what they learned. My goal is to inspire you by seeing yourself in others. I believe that when we feel more connected and seen, magic can happen. And remember, if you find yourself sitting on a comma in your life, you can also talk to me without a microphone. To explore coaching with me and getting off the comma in your own life, check out my information and book a call with me at offthecomma.com. And I'm also doing something different. I'm curating my own sponsor community, local businesses and professionals who I handpick and who align with our vision here. Be sure to check them out, learn more about them on my website and my YouTube channel. In the meantime, let's get into this week's conversation. And we're back with another episode of Off the Comma, and very excited to just be rolling right into the year with, these stories, and so grateful to be able to continue to do this work from all over the place. And if you've been following my Substack at this point, you are aware of the fact that I have been traveling around the country and doing the nomad thing for a little while. And so I'm just so grateful for being able to continue to do the podcast work and continue to meet all of these amazing people and continue to collect. And because today's guest and I were talking before the recording, he used the word amplify, and to be able to amplify all of these amazing voices. So we are back with another powerful episode this week. And we're also back again with, I've just been on a roll for months of meeting new people and having new people come to the podcast and getting to know people through their stories that I didn't previously know. So this week is no exception. We are talking today to Mark Wigginton, and I'm going to stop rambling and I'm going to turn it over to you, Mark, and let you introduce yourself. Before we get into your story a little bit later, tell us, Mark, how would you like to be known and what would you like us to know about you?
Well, thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. Like we were talking about before the story, I'm actually a fan of the show, so it's really kind of cool to have a chance to be here and share with you. So I think the three adjectives that I would want to be described with today as I go through is being grateful. I'm also very much in the process of evolving, and that's, I think, part of the reason that I was attracted to your podcast and happy to be here. And then I feel like the third adjective that really describes me right now is generous. That I try to be sharing in my story and in my energy as my story unfolds.
I love that. And you and I, obviously, we were talking a little bit before. So there's parts of the story that folks aren't going to get to hear unless they come out and evolve into your story. But this definitely, it kind of resonates with some of the things that you were sharing. And I'm looking forward to seeing how these traits come out in the story that you are going to be sharing with us a little bit later on. What else would you like for folks to know about you? Hobbies, interests, work, all the usual stuff that we do.
Yeah, the kind of the usual suspect things. Part of it's going to come out in my story as well. One of those kids that moved a lot. I moved maybe 20 times before I got out of high school and went to 10 different schools. My journey really continued as I moved into my 20s and 30s, except I got to Austin, like we talked about before, and really settled in Austin as a home. But the movement then moved into my work world. I moved into a phase where I had lots of different jobs trying to sort through who I was. When I was 30, I'm going to talk a lot about ages as some of the comments and some of the links here. But when I was 30, I went back to graduate school. I got a master's degree in counseling psychology, and I spent 7 years working in community mental health. I worked at the Travis County Jail as a counselor in an inpatient incarcerated drug rehab center. And I worked pretty much in the greater Central Texas area at every facility, mental health facility that was available. So lots of transition there. As we get into the story, we'll see that there was really a big change that hit for me in my late 30s, and I wound up back in the business world. Again, still kind of a journeyman, doing lots of different things. And in my mid 40s, I went through a pretty major life change, and really found that movement evolved into something really different for me that I think we'll talk about. Paul, I want to say I'm a homework guy. And so our friend Grammarly and I spent some time together getting ready for this to kind of understand about a comma, understand about commas and semicolons. And I did that purposely because I wanted to be able to reflect into my story about commas and really understand what it means, right? So according to our friends at Grammarly, a comma is a smaller break than a period, right? It's a soft pause, a punctuation mark that separates clauses and joins them together. And it's different than a semicolon, right? And a semicolon is something that really brings two related but very different topics together. And I think that's the story of my life, right? Is that I've had a series. I'm 64, so I've had a series of commas through my life, and then I had a major semicolon, a major life-changing moment that changed, the first 45 years of my life and the last 20 years of my life, that are the most recent, not the last, the most recent 20 years of my life as I've gone through.
I so appreciate you bringing that into it. That's one of the things that I really enjoy about these conversations in each episode is every guest brings kind of their own perspective about the comma and the comma metaphor and so forth. And sometimes people are very like specific, very clear about this is what this comma means to me, or this is what sitting on a comma or getting off the comma means to me. Other folks kind of sort of play with it and explore with it a little bit. And I love how you brought that in as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing how that unfolds. Before we get to your story, which is now next, one of the things I do with every guest, Mark, is as you look ahead to the next, let's say 40 minutes or so in the telling of your story with us today, what intention would you have for yourself?
Well, that's a really good question too. And I've been thinking a lot about that as I go through here. And this is maybe going to sound odd, but I want to come to my story today from a place of scars instead of a place of wounds as I go through. And if you think about, so if you're a writer, I try to do some writing. An autobiography is really kind of about the true details of your story. So it's about the scars that have happened in your life. And a memoir is more kind of about the wounds, the scars, the things that have, that you've overcome as you've gone through, and what the message is. And for me, that's what this podcast is about, that message about the scars. So my intent today is to come from that place where I can share the things that I've learned on my journey, on my multiple commas and my semicolon as I've gone through, and be able to share that message in a way that it resonates with other people.
I love that. And I want to comment on that, but first I want to say I see your intention, and my intention is to support you in that, to tell your story from the angle or from the direction of the scars versus the wounds. My intention is that in creating the space for you to be able to tell the story, that there will be people out there who will see a little bit of themselves in you and your story. It will resonate with them. They'll feel a little bit less alone, a little bit more connected, and in the best of cases, even inspired or empowered to go and do something that they've been wanting to do.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, for me, the whole point of this thing is that wherever you are in your journey, it's really never too late to start again.
I want to ask you before this first question, then the scars and wounds, what I take that to mean is that the scars are the evidence of the story after it happens and you've healed. The wounds are the situation, the story while it's happening, and the healing is yet to happen. That's how I take it to mean. Is that, how did you mean it?
That's exactly how I meant it. Right. Going through that journey. And then even as you kind of recover your story and start to look through it, those wounds sometimes are even more fresh.
Mark, can I jump in for just a moment? Because I think you're starting to get into the story. So I want to be able to officially ask that first question and then open it up for you to really get into your story, if that's okay. So the first question, Mark, is where in your life have you found yourself sitting on a comma?
there are really big segments, right? And they're my clauses that are divided by the commas, and and they all grew on each other as they went through. And so the kind of the first big block of time was my youth, and until I was about 20. And like I said, I moved a lot. I lived lots of different places. I went to 10 schools before the 10th grade and never really was grounded. And then I was fortunate enough to go to high school all in one place. And then my journey started again, right? I went through, I went into the military. I tried to go to college. That didn't work. I went into the military. That didn't work. I went back to school. I found my lifelong relationship in my 20s back then. And together we began to kind of build a life and move forward here in time into Austin. I got a bachelor's degree in psychology and was working at night in a lock psych ward. And in the daytime, I was working as a trainer, teaching people how to use new technology. So I had that kind of first stage that was all about kind of physical movement. And when I was 30, I went back and got a master's degree in psychology. I spent time, as I said, working in community mental health and went back into business. So that phase of my life was all about trying to discover myself in my work life and trying to deal with some of the challenges that I had in my life, particularly around perfectionism and issues like that. And then that led me to my semicolon, which was a major life transition that brought me into kind of the last phase of my life. And that's when movement really changed for me. So in the early parts, the theme was movement, physical movement, and kind of emotional movement. And in the most recent phase, it's been about physical movement, about health, about running and growing in that way. So those are through the three phases.
So different phases. Go ahead and kind of tell us more, like go in further. What was happening with you sitting on this or these commas, kind of what was going on at the time. The microphone is yours. I'll jump in from time to time, as you know, and ask questions and so forth. But tell us more about what was happening with the comma. What was it like?
So, I think where I really want to start, and I'm going to talk in ages, and where I really want to start is around the time I was 30, in my late 20s. I was really struggling, and I was struggling with alcohol and issues like that. And I went to rehab when I was 30 for the first time. And when I was in rehab, I really started to uncover myself. I went to a place that was in Canada, and so it had a very different approach than kind of the typical approach and what I would learn as a typical approach when I worked in rehab centers in the following years. It really focused a lot less on the substance, and a lot more on the issue. So people will say alcoholism or whatever. And so it focused less on the alcohol and more on the ism and kind of understanding who I really was. And I was really, really moved and empowered and that time. And I decided I was going to make a major life change. And that's when I went back to school and got my master's degree so that I could work as a counselor, work as a therapist. And I came out and I spent an awful lot of time working in the field. And like I said, I worked at rehab centers all over the place, and I did groups and I did individual sessions, and I learned a lot. And in my head, I learned a lot about addiction and substance use and what is now substance use disorder. And I would help people every single day struggle. Working at an inpatient rehab center in a jail, you're working with people who have really had consequences because they were not able to manage. They were out of control, right? And so every day I would be working with people that were relapsing and trying to get back on track and trying to learn it and having consequences and working through. And that was my daily life for 7 years. And then 7 years in, that was me. I found myself in a place where I relapsed. I mean, I was in a place where I can remember as if it was 5 minutes ago, that I sat down and I had a beer and I was overwhelmed in my life. And I just was broken when that happened. And I felt like I had betrayed everything that I had learned. Right. So I was there and it was okay, Paul. It was okay if you relapsed. I would be able to talk you through that. I would be able to help you get back on track. But for me, it wasn't acceptable. It wasn't acceptable to me because it meant that I was, I wasn't perfect. I was kind
Mm.
of human and had to go through that risk. And there was a period of a few months when I was struggling with it. I wouldn't tell anybody about it. I had a circle around me, but I couldn't tell anyone about what was going on. The shame was so deep at having done that. And ultimately it led me to a place where I left that field, right? I couldn't deal with it. And so I went back into the business world and I created a life for myself that that enabled me to continue on that downward journey. Right. I mean,
Mm.
I began working as a consultant on the road, weeks at a time, away from home, away from support system, in a world, kind of the real world. I mean, you're
Mm.
going to go have drinks
Mm-hmm.
after work, right? And so I became really involved in that kind of world, and started again kind of job hopping. I'd get angry or something would happen or I would quit and I wouldn't be able to keep moving, I wouldn't keep the job. I would move on to something new. And that kind of continued to progress. I was literally flying all over the country, doing
Mm.
training classes and teaching sales coaching and all these different elements. And when I was in my early 40s, like 43, 44, I was with my wife. We went up to visit some family, and there was this road race, this running road race that was in upstate New York called the Boilermaker, and it's a 12K race.
Mm.
And the family that we were going to visit lived up there, and the cousin that we were going to visit, her name was Cindy. Cindy was running in the race. And so Cindy and I talked after the race. I watched her do it. She's a normal person, she's not like a super athlete or anything. And I said, I'm going to do this with you next year. And so we made a commitment to each other that when I was 44, so in 2004, we were going to do this race together. Well, I'm still on the road now, Paul. Right now, at that point in time, I was still out. I weighed about 225 pounds. You know, my life was not working, but I
Mm.
began to run a little bit. And so I went back up the next year, and Cindy and I ran the race, and we talked about the fact that hey, if we can do this 12K race, then we could do a half marathon. And we
Mm.
committed that a few months later we would do a half marathon. And we came down to Austin, and she came down to Austin. We went up to Dallas and did a race, and then we did a race in Austin. And then the next year, I was still on the road. I was still kind of struggling with everything, and we decided that on Labor Day we were going to do a race together in Virginia, a half marathon in Virginia. And I was working on the road, and so I flew up to Virginia to do this. I'd been this year, Paul, the year that this all happened, I was on the road 200 days straight without coming home.
Mm.
So I was emotionally exhausted. I was mentally exhausted. My life was like really out of control. And I went up to do that race, and I flew home not home, but I flew back to the job that I was working on. And I was really, really angry and depressed. And I hit my semicolon. I went from
Mm.
Saturday running that race to Sunday night having handcuffs on me for a DUI. So I had
Mm.
evolved in this period of time from this person committed to helping other people grow and committing you know, to recovery, to making the same mistake that I had taught people about over and over again, how to get through, but I couldn't do it for me. And
Mm.
I I would never have imagined that that's where I would be, that I would be on the side of the road, doing the dance, doing the hokey pokey with and winding up in handcuffs and in the drunk tank, basically.
Yeah. If I could, I'd love to to jump in and kind of reflect a couple of things, acknowledge you, and also ask a drill down question before we continue. So, I mean, first of all, just a huge acknowledgement to you for the awareness, right? Like, I mean, and being able to share the story, because a lot of folks, I believe, would probably not be willing to share. But like even you said, like there was a period of time that I wasn't talking about it, I wasn't sharing it, I wasn't explaining it, and there's this kind of sort of full circle that happened. And it sounds like that was an extremely difficult time for you during all of this. as somebody who traveled a pretty fair amount in at points in my career, I definitely can appreciate and relate to the amount of stress and disorientation that can cause when you're just not even grounded in a home place. I did have a question for you, because you walked us through and were telling us about everything. What I'm really curious about is what changed for you that started you, because it sounded like the way you described it, that there was kind of a point that all of a sudden it feels like it shifted, or maybe it wasn't all of a sudden, but what changed for you at that point? It was some paragraphs ago in my notes that you said you started drinking and then that ultimately started you down the path.
Yeah.
What happened there?
You know, I don't know if I can really even say, it was just, I was overwhelmed. So working in community mental health, I was working at the jail, and then I'd get out of work at the jail, and I go do groups at, any one of the 5 rehab centers. There's a term in the mental community called PRN, right? And so whatever they need, they call you and you go in and do it. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
I was struggling. I was trying to find things out. And frankly, we got to a place where even with everything I was doing, we were at risk of not being able to pay our mortgage,
Mm-hmm.
and just
Mm-hmm.
that stress just overwhelmed me. And Paul, I mean, I don't know if today, I don't know if that's an excuse, if it was a legitimate catalyst, or if it was just that now it's time for me to go back out,
Mm-hmm.
and but that's what happened. I got overwhelmed, and then there were a few months where I really kind of struggled, and I was working. I was I left the jail and was working with a person that I really trusted as somebody that was really, I thought would be a really good person for me to partner with. And we went on a conference together. He paid for me to go with him. And we went to California, and it turned out that he lived one life, same thing, right? He lived one life when we were
Mm-hmm.
together and had family responsibilities, and another life when we were on the road. And so by the time we finished that trip, I was like, I'm out. And I'm clearly have made a big transition here. And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't face these people. I feel like I am such a failure because I couldn't do it right, that I didn't have a choice. And so I went back again. I went back into the business world, and then it was 8 years of increasingly poor decisions from that time.
Mm.
From time I was 37 to the time I was 45.
What I hear is, and I hear this a lot, and I've experienced it myself, is, when that pressure and that stress mounts, and then you're looking for some kind of an outlet, you're looking for some kind of relief. Often it's wherever the relief can come from. I mean,
Yeah.
and I know you said, like, I think you used the word excuses. Like, here, we don't judge or evaluate. It's like just what happened, and it is what it is,
Right.
right? You can evaluate that on your own, right? And so
Right.
forth. But it sounds like the stress and the pressure mounted. Then there was this pivotal. Oh, I can't talk today. This pivotal choice that happened, and then it kind of started that next layer of emotions: the embarrassment, the shame,
Right.
the all of the things that you talked about. And then it's
Yeah.
like, it's kind of like, I don't know, you tell me. I'm just reflecting, but it's like, after a certain point, it's kind of like, if you can't beat them, join them.
Yeah, it became weirdly comfortable to do that, but at the same time, your listeners who may have struggled with recovery or struggled with some of these issues know that you have a beer, and the voice is still in the back of your head,
Mm-hmm.
and so you have another one, because then you've got to try to shut the voice up, right? I mean, I think a really lot of it comes back to, again, and my word was excuse, because that was my
Mm-hmm.
perfectionism talking, right? I mean, I obviously had to, could never be perfect, right?
Yeah.
I could obviously never, that it's who I really was. The imposter started to show
Well, and
through.
that's important. I think I'd love to, let me kind of single this out, and then you add to it, and then we're going to go to our second question. Well, actually, we're going to pick up where you left off, and then I want to go to the second question,
Yeah.
because I love your story, or I love your story because I can relate to it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Is you talked about living a double life. There was I'm now
Yep.
drinking and I'm now doing these things, and I've quit what I was doing. I've gone to work in the business world, traveling and so forth, but I'm not really talking about the drinks that I'm having and all of the things that you're describing, right? So there's the double life in terms of how you appear on the outside, right? To the outward world. But I don't think a lot of people really acknowledge and call attention to the fact that you were just talking about, which is there's a double life I'm living inside my own head, because there's a part of me that's
Yeah.
drinking or whatever the substance or whatever the outlet is, right? There's a part of me that's doing it because I'm just trying to find comfort and relief and shut the voice up. But there's
Right.
also a voice that says, this is not who you are. This is not what you want. And so
Right.
there's a constant daily battle there, right? Between
Yeah.
the, I'm just,
Hourly.
yeah, exactly. And I'm just going to do the thing because that's some kind of relief. And yet I know this isn't going to ultimately serve me at the end of the day. And I have to drink a whole lot in order for it to finally be okay. But then it's not okay 12 hours later. And so that
Right.
double life isn't just what we walk on the streets, it's what's going on
Right.
in the head. And so,
Yeah. And the thing is that there was so much of that. So before I make my next statement, um, I've talked about the scars and the wounds, right? And so working through this process now, right? I'm 64. This happened 20 years
mm-hmm.
ago. Today it's wounds. 5 months ago it was still scars.
Mm.
So just to caveat that, right? That it's still that I'm still kind of digging through all this. But there were really important fundamental things that I learned and believed that I learned as I went on that journey, as I went on the journey of, working in that community, experiencing that community, things that never went away. Right. And that's part of that conflict that you just talked about so well, is that those things never went away. They were still there as they went through.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm going to go. I know we still have to resume your story, but I want to bring the second question into it, and then you can kind of go back and forth.
Okay.
The second question is, as you look back at the comma that you were sitting on, what did that create for you?
Yeah.
And before you actually answer that, I want to also bring us back to, okay, you've just done the hokey pokey on the side of the road. You've got handcuffs, and now you're the person that you spent 7 years trying to support.
Yeah.
Where would you like to take us at this point in your story?
I want to take you to the other side of the journey.
Okay.
Because that's my semicolon, right? So that was my semicolon. That was bringing the two independent clauses together that could each stand alone as a distinct sentence, right? That's what a semicolon does. And that was the turning point for me in my life. That was like, oh my God, how did I get here? I mean, my grandfather raised me. He was a cop for 30 years. I've had the gift of this recovery program and all the different things that were involved in that. How did I get here? And most importantly, how the hell am I going to get out of here? How am I going to change the situation? The bottom line is that I decided that what I really needed to do was find a way to make some changes in my life. And one of the first things I needed to do was get off the road. And it took me a while to do that. It was hard too, because I had to go and address my company, and talk about the fact that, hey, yeah, I'm a road warrior and you send me all over the country to do these projects. And guess what? I just lost my driver's license. And I expected them to fire me, and they supported me. And I never expected it. I expected that I'd go in and I would tell them that, and the next day I'd be, looking for a job. And they
can I share something too? I think this is interesting because you shared it, and because I think there's people listening, and you and I, neither one of us are going to be like, yay, go out and get a DUI. That's not the thing. But to your point, I was so terrified after I got my DUI in 2008. And then there were some years later that I was interviewing for a job, and I was petrified because, you have to do your little background check and everything like that. And petrified that it wasn't going to go through. I'd done all the interviews and everything. It's like, now I've got to disclose this, and how do you disclose it and everything? And I remember it was interesting. I ended up getting the job, and it wasn't a deal breaker. Obviously, I had to disclose. I had to go through the process. I remember somebody said, if we didn't hire all the people who've had DUIs, we probably wouldn't have a workforce. And I was just like, oh my God.
Paul, I will just say in the same thing. The company that I worked for was a small company, and the company had a strong spiritual bent. I'll just kind of say that. And the two guys that I worked for, primarily, both were retired military officers, and they said exactly the same thing that you just said, right? That we just, each of us just spent 35 years in the Army. And if you think you're the first person that's come to us that said they made a stupid mistake,
Mm.
then, then you're making a stupid mistake, right? To
Hmm.
think that. And to the point, so again, I was driving all over the place. These guys were senior. They'd done their journey on the road and done all that. They picked up all my work.
Oh,
What
wow.
they did that, one of the big things that we did was we did a lot of work in the DC market, the Washington DC market. And so I would be the flyover country guy and they would be the DC people because they could
Mhm.
sleep in their own beds and everything, right? So gave me all those assignments and they did all the things in the road because I could keep working. I could take the metro, you know, I could get
Mhm.
an Uber from the airport. I could take a metro to the job site. I could do what I needed to. And you know, they showed me a kind of loyalty that I had ever really experienced, or a kind of honor, you know?
That had to be a huge relief given kind of the burden that you were carrying and the
Yeah.
stress that you were holding and as you were disclosing this.
Yep. And
Mm.
one of the really hard parts was that I had to let that company go because I had to take care of myself. Right. And
Mhm.
they knew that and they understood it. Right. They got it. They understood why I had to make that change. Um, and I did. It took me it took me a while. It took me a few months, about 6 or 7 months, to go through the decision. They gave me the space and the time to sort it out. I was able to talk about it publicly with them, as I was weighing this decision. I wasn't hiding it anymore because I couldn't hide it as I went
Mhm.
through. And so ultimately I kind of made that decision. And the funny thing about it is that, like, I don't know, the timelines kind of get confused because it was all happening in real time at once. But maybe 6 months later, I got a call from the company, and they said, "Hey, there was the salesperson in this particular region left, and it was the Texas area." And he said, "Do you know anybody that might be interested in the job?" And I gave him 2 or 3 names. And I said, "Yeah, here's some people that might be interested."
Mhm.
And they called me back a little bit later and said, "None of those people worked. Do you know anybody else?" And I gave them a couple more names, and they called me back a third time and they said, "You know what? We still haven't found anybody." And I said, "Well, maybe it's me."
Mm.
And they brought me back in this role, in a different role where I had more power, right? I was managing a region, I was selling, I was working with my clients, and I stayed there for the rest of my career.
Wow.
So I need to just kind of put a stamp on that for a second, because if you think about it, the timing that I'm talking about here, from the period, from 1992 to 2007. So from the time I got out of graduate school till the time I hit that relapse in 2005, and then I made this decision to come back to work in 2007, I had over 20 jobs.
Mm.
Right. I mean, I bounced. Part of that was when I was in mental health, I would work 4 or 5 things at a time, but I had 20 different jobs. And then from 2007 to when I left the company and retired in 2022, I had one job.
Wow.
I mean, I settled. That's why I say movement is such an important part of my life, because a different kind of movement took me over. Right. I mean, all that
Mhm.
moving in school and jobs and all that stuff. And then, when I had my DWI experience, I was like, I've got to change my life. And, I said that was my semicolon. And I made a total change at that point. I mean, I started eating better. I lost 50 pounds. I began to really increase my focus on my health and on running. I went from running those half marathons to running marathons, to putting myself through lots of time with myself, on the road, lots of training, lots of working through that. And then that evolved into doing triathlons. So, instead of just running,
Mm.
you're riding, you're swimming, and you're riding your bike, and then you're running. And that ultimately led to a place, it was a long journey, 2005 to 2015, I did an Ironman triathlon. So, in
Wow.
10 years, I went from, this 225-pound guy who pounded hamburgers and beers and lived on the road and had this crappy lifestyle, to losing 50 pounds and, swimming 2.5 miles, then riding my bike for 112, then running a marathon.
Wow.
And, that journey, that's, that's the semicolon. That's the next connecting clause, right? That's the
Mhm.
journey. when my life totally changed, you know?
It's interesting because I've been sitting here thinking, what do you mean when you say, from one type of movement to another? And here's what I'm taking from it, and you correct me where I misstate. But all these little movements in that first phase of your life that you were talking about from 92 to '07, 20 movements in jobs, plus you haven't even scratched the surface, and I'm sure couldn't even share with us all the other movements and all the type of movement that was happening in your world during that period of time. And then this big movement, which really wasn't even about the jobs necessarily as much as it was like this big movement in just your mindset, your way of living,
Yeah.
your life, your perspective, which then created like that one big movement, then just
Yeah.
kind of created a stability.
Right. Exactly.
But there really was more movement, right? Because now all the movement is in you and for you.
And targeted.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't all dispersed. It was planned. What I learned, I kind of say that movement taught me to settle.
Oh,
Right.
okay.
So because I had to learn how to work a plan. You don't just go, okay, dude, you're 45 years old, you're gonna go run 20 marathons in, the next 20 years. I mean, you don't do that. You have to plan, you have to build, you have to structure, you have to work, you have to do all that. When I made the decision to try to do a triathlon, I was 49 years old and didn't know how to swim.
Mm.
And I said, I'm going to learn how to swim before I'm 50 years old. And,
Mm.
and Paul, I went the first time I got in the water to do an event like that. I went literally 20 feet, and my heart, I thought I was going to die. My heart rate
Mm.
spiked so high, I got pulled out of the water. And you said that you've lived here. So with Decker Lake, if you know Decker Lake here in Austin. And that was in March, and 6 months or 7 months later in October, I did a half Ironman, and I swam 1.2 miles in that same water.
Wow.
You know,
Wow.
and in March I was like 2 lengths of the pool, and I'm huffing and puffing, right? And it's that kind of focus. And then that focus transferred into my work world, right? I mean, that
Mm.
focus transferred into me not being a victim anymore and not blaming anymore. I mean, being able to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, right? This is how I'm going to work my business. This is how I'm going to treat my customers, and guess what? Company, if that doesn't work for you, that's okay. But this is how I'm going to do it. And then I saw the
Mm.
benefits of that. I saw what that worked, with that, how that played out in my life, and how much joy my work brought me after all of that time of of
Mm.
of searching and struggling. And we're being pretty honest with each other here, Paul. I was drinking during that time. I was managing it well. I thought, I was doing better. I might have something once in a while. I was not the guy that was living on the road, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I changed a lot of my habits. But I wasn't perfect, and that was
Mm-hmm.
okay. And I was never going to win one of those races, and that was
Okay.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
I had to learn how to accept kind of the limits of my capabilities, and then work to those limits and expand them. But I had to acknowledge that, what, there's somebody better than me. There's
Mm-hmm.
somebody that's going to be, in my age group. If there's going to be 10 guys in my age group, I'm going to be seventh. If there's 100 guys in my age group, I'm going to be 70th. Right. And that's
Mm-hmm.
okay, because I love it, because because of what I'm learning and what's happening in my world.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and doing it for the passion of it, right? Not the
yeah.
competition of it. And that sounds like also it was a big shift for you. Where you're sharing your story right now is a good time to transition into the third question, because I feel like you've already started taking us there, which is, as you look back at the comma that you were sitting on, what did you learn about yourself?
Oh my gosh. I mean, really, it was learning that I didn't have limits, that I
Mm.
wasn't, it was learning that I wasn't a victim of the mistakes I'd made in my past more than anything, right? That
Mm.
it was, it was learning I didn't have to be a victim of failure, of trying, that I could try, you know, it's, it all came back then. It all came back then to the 12-step program, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
came back to the lesson. It came back to really knowing what one day at a time means, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not a month, a year, 5 years, 30 years. I sucked because I was sober for 7 years and I went back out. It's today I get a choice to start again.
Mm.
Today I have a plan. Today I know what I'm going to do to take care of myself. Right. And, it became, I began to own it. So I would sit in classes, I would sit and do classes at rehab centers. I don't know how deeply you are into the 12-step program, but you can get deep into, the rhetoric of the 12-step program. And you can get into talking about things like, the cornerstone and the capstone and, the keystone and all that kind of stuff. And I could sit there and talk all day and pontificate about all that stuff, but I didn't own it for who I was. I didn't own what that meant. And that's, I didn't own it. And I started to own it then, right? I started to own it as I went through that process and learn, go back 20 years to take those lessons and really begin to apply them in who I was and in what was happening in my life. And, and it took me forward, Paul, to my kind of the next big milestone was just last year. And it's the one that has me reflecting on all of this stuff now. And it's that, in a very short period of time last year, I lost my mother, my stepmother, and my father in 100 days last year.
Oh, wow.
But it took me on this journey, right? It took me on this reflective journey, just trying to recover from that. It took me on this reflective journey that now I can see that 30 years of lessons, from the time I went to rehab. I can see everything that happened. I can see the story and the thread. And, and so that I'm integrating the lessons now, right? And if there was something I wanted people to take away from this, it's that you can integrate the lessons as you go. You don't have to wait to the, obviously it's not the end, but you don't have to wait until it's late. If you can integrate them as you go, and you can kind of accept where you are. I may have gone off track. Sorry.
No, that's it's beautiful. And I so appreciate you sharing that with us. And I want to acknowledge, all of that loss in such a short period of time would be enough to really to crush and to sink many people. And not to say that you didn't, but you had all of these years of learning, as you've as you just said to us, like all these years of learning to kind of help you get through it. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. I want to jump into the fourth question as well, because you've talked about everything that you've learned. The fourth question is, what has changed for you, or what is changing for you as a result of sitting on this comma?
Yeah. Like I said, it's hard to select one of those commas and separate that whole thread, right? But again, what I've really learned is, one day, living my life one day at a time means living my life one day at a time. It means being focused on the present and not being caught up in what I couldn't do or what I didn't do or how I didn't achieve or even how I did. None of that matters. It's all in the past, or it's all tomorrow. It's like, how do I squeeze the juice out of what I have today?
Well, and it sounds like all the things that you've shared with us as well. Like well, here, let's open this up for just a moment. You shared, you went through your semicolon moment. That was the start of the turnaround. You started changing. The focus was now on you and taking care of yourself and your health and your well-being. The focus was on putting energy into a new way of being at work, a new type of job, if you will, even though it was back with the same company again. The focus was now on things like running, swimming, competing, triathlons, eating, the loss of weight. What would you say is the trait? Like, what are the traits within you that changed?
So when you said that, what came up for me was that I was managing the things that were in my control, right? What you think of me is not in my control. What happened in the past wasn't in my control. What I did now and what I planned were things I could control, right? And if I screwed up, I screwed up. And I could start again. You have to be consistent. One thing you learn in endurance training is the importance of consistency. No
Hmm.
training plan ever goes perfectly, right? And so that's the metaphor is that, right? For me, it was the metaphor of that nothing, no training plan ever goes perfectly, and that's part of the game, you know?
You shared with us earlier, blame, shame, embarrassment, right? And that's a theme that comes up a lot. And certainly those are words that are near and dear to my heart. And it's interesting you talk about the power of consistency, right? If we could put the same consistency into the things that you've described, the eating, the running, the swimming, the competing, and so forth, if we could put that same level of consistency in those types of pursuits that we put into the things that we say to ourselves when we're being judgmental and harsh and that sort of thing, like, because like it's interesting, I'm just kind of pontificating for a moment, like for those of us who at some point in our lives or are currently still living in blame, shame, embarrassment, judgment, for a fact that you have those voices telling you that consistently every single day,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
All day long
Yep.
sometimes. And there's your evidence. There's your evidence that consistency is within your grasp, consistency is within your control,
Yeah.
and that although you may not believe it right now, and although it may not feel like it right now, if you can be that consistent with how harshly you judge yourself, you can be equally and oppositely, if I can make up that word, consistent in how well you love yourself and how well you attend to your needs.
Yep. And yeah, you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And, that consistency of behavior. And, another thing that I learned in that journey, talking about self-talk and talking about
Mm-hmm.
consistency as you go through there, is that so clearly I'm not fast. I mean, I told you that, if there's gonna be a race, I'm gonna be I'm gonna be in the bottom 30%, right, of the event. So that's a lot of time on your own. That's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of time listening to that guy inside your brain, right? Who is going, what the heck are you doing out here?
Mm-hmm.
And working through that process. And as I age, that time got longer and longer. And so you've got to learn to be able to embrace that voice in your head and quit fighting that voice in your head, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you can embrace that voice in your head, you can kind of put it in its place, right? You can acknowledge it and say, yeah, you're right. Yeah, we made a pretty tough decision here, Mark. And guess what? We're going to stick it out,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Well, it's interesting. I'm going to jump in with a little bit of coach speak too, right? And I know you're familiar with
Yeah.
this as well.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things we talk about in coaching when it comes to the sabotaging voice that I'm
Yeah.
so glad you said this is when you say you can embrace it without, having to like give into it, or I don't remember your exact words. You can acknowledge that the voice is there. You can acknowledge that that voice is in your head, but you don't have to engage with it,
And you
right?
don't have to fight it.
Yeah, because fighting it is engaging with it, which is
Right.
exactly what it wants you to do. You can say, "Hey,
Yeah.
I see you. I notice you're here in the room, but I'm not going to talk to you. Like, I'm not going to try to push you out. I'm not going to try to argue with you, fight with you. I'm going to go and do my things and recognize that you're here. But as
Yeah.
soon as you start getting into a battle with the voice, you've already lost."
And again, just one more running analogy on this voice thing is that there are external voices too, right?
Mm-hmm.
I laugh because you're at the back of the pack in a marathon or in a triathlon. I was said it took me every minute of the 17 hours allotted to do that Ironman.
Mm.
You're in the back, people are externalizing that voice.
Oh, wow.
And the most important thing you got to do is get away from those people,
Mm.
because then you'll start to internalize the voice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's environment, right? That's part of this whole process too, is that you have to be able to manage your environment, and part of your environment is not just your internal voice, but it's the external voice of the people that are around you.
Mm-hmm.
That may be creating a negative environment. I laughed. One of my friends ran their very first marathon, and they said, and they were like me, they were back of the packer, and they were like, what's the single most important thing? And I said, when you're late in that race and you're walking because you're struggling, and somebody comes next to you and starts whining, that's when you start running again. And it
Mm.
might be 30 seconds, but you need to get away from that person, because that person will get in your voice and their negativity will resonate with you, and that'll amplify that voice. And that's
Mm.
true in everything we do in our lives, right? I mean, you know, we in this country are going through a challenge with that right now, right? About
Hmm.
the changes in voices that are occurring, and decisions that happen tied to voices, right?
Yeah.
And we've got to continue to be able to monitor our own beliefs about our own voices.
And recognize some things too. Like, I don't know how it fits. And then I'm going to go into the fifth question here, but I love what you said. And this just kind of came up for me. I feel like I want to insert this into our conversation for folks to hear is that you talk about the back of the Packers, the last hour, the 17 hours or what have you. And yet just a couple of things. One, you're still way beyond the beginning of any race for a large percentage of the population who would never do that
Yeah,
race, right? So already you're the back of the pack of the very tip of the spear for what most of us will probably never do. So there's that.
yeah,
Okay, just like perspective, right? And somebody who might be at the front of the pack of the next race who's looking to you as like, oh, you're my hero, look what you're doing, recognizing that even your heroes might feel like they're at the back of the pack and have judgments and self doubt. And also, like, that everyone, no matter what they're accomplishing, no matter what they've achieved, is probably fighting their own battles in order to get there and to do that. Right.
absolutely.
So,
Everybody is running their own race.
mhm.
It's that old story, Paul. Put your problem in a hat, right? Go in a room, have everybody put their problem in a hat. Do you want to draw your problem out, or do you want to draw somebody else's problem out
Yeah.
of the hat? I mean, that's exactly the same thing.
Love it. And there's so much more, right? Like, I just want to acknowledge there's
Yeah,
so much more about your story that I'd
yeah.
love to continue to dig into. As we bring things to a close, let's ask the fifth question. Mark, what does getting off the comma look like for you?
It's integrating all those lessons, right? I mean, we've talked about the fact that it's a compound sentence. There's a bunch of commas,
Hmm.
and every one of those commas I learned something from. All the movement as a kid led me to a place where I was able to kind of build quickly, build relationships quickly. So that let me, work as a consultant and go in and make an impact, right? Going through all of those jobs in that middle phase led me to a place where I learned best practices in a jillion different companies, right? And when I
Mm.
came back into my into that last phase where I had the one job for 15 years, I took all of that experience forward. And that's how I was able to build customer relationships. So when I squeeze the juice out of each of the sections, right, then that leads to more and more resilience. And I think that's what I take away from all of it is resilience. And then
Mm.
that same resilience crossed over into my physical life as well, being able to stick it out.
Yeah, I love that. So, okay, so much more that you could share, and in that vein, I want to open it up. Like, as folks who are listening might want to learn more about your story, maybe see what you're up to, reach out to you, contact you. I'll put all the links in the show notes. Where could people find you?
The best place to reach out to me is through LinkedIn. And you can either look up my name, Mark Wigginton, and I'll be the one Mark Wigginton that's connected to Paul Briley. I won't be the one that's the Portland International Raceway director or the minister as we go through. And
Mark
so my
Wigginton, Austin, right?
yeah, yep. And my coaching practice is called Focusing on Results, and I'm also in LinkedIn that way as I go through. Or you can email me at markw@focusingonresults.
Awesome. Cool. And, obviously this platform is not just about, having you here today to share your story, lifting up individual stories and being able to pull our own inspiration from each other. It's also like your story wouldn't be complete if we didn't give you an opportunity to lift up others who matter to you. And so this section we do at the end of every podcast is called acknowledgments.
Yep.
And it's your opportunity to give a voice or boost or lift up others that matter to you. And that can be causes, organizations, other creators, people in your life who matter. So,
Yeah.
who would you like to acknowledge today?
I can't not acknowledge my wife and my life partner, Marcia. We met when we were kids. We get married when we were 22. And it's been a 40-year journey.
Mm.
We laugh about the fact that our journey started, when we had to buy box pizza crust and macaroni and cheese and it's and our life has evolved together. She stayed with me through all of those journeys, through all of that time that I was gone, all the time that I was that my life was out of control, and I wouldn't be who I am without her love and support, her partnership, her real partnership. So she's like the most important person in my world. I wanted to also talk about an issue that's really important to me, and that's food insecurity. You don't have an opportunity to grow if you don't have basic needs like food and shelter. In my journey, my mental health journey, when I was in that phase, I worked with a lot of kids who didn't have food, and so food banks are very important to me. The capital area food bank here in Austin is really important to me. One of the places where I draw my strength is Maui, and we all know about the disaster that happened in Maui. That food bank, at the time of this recording, there'd been disasters in North Carolina and Florida, whatever, just wherever you are. It's also, at the time of this recording, it's also close to the holidays, which is a really important time for making sure that food banks have what they need. And they would always much rather have cash than food, because they can buy exactly what they need for their people and make sure that they get breaks, they get discounts. So it's always better to send cash than to send a box of macaroni and cheese.
Well, and I'd love to add to that too, right?
Yes.
Like it's not only the natural disasters or the holidays. Like we're finding more and more that it's all day, every day, it's people that you probably know as well. So supporting your local food banks with cash, as you said, so that they can allocate that in the ways that they need to support their communities. And I would even add, if I may, I don't usually co-opt somebody's acknowledgments, but it's okay to be a food bank yourself as well. Like you probably know people who could benefit from having
help.
some food.
I mean, even here, Paul, we talked before the thing that you lived here in Austin, and the changes and the growth and it's a pretty prosperous town. And I think back to COVID and the miles of cars. I mean, you lived in Fort Worth as well. Same thing, miles of cars of people who never thought they would need help. So anyway, so the last thing I want to do is acknowledge a book that has really impacted me. I talked about my mother's death, and the day of her memorial service, I was running, as I always was. And I was listening to a podcast, and the podcaster talked about a book called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. It's an oldie, 30-year-old book. And it has really been part of my journey. The tools of journaling, the creative outlets are things that have, I would not be here telling you this story today if I wasn't using those tools. So anybody that's trying to work their way through their journey, pick it up. It's a great tool.
I love it. Mark, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us today. Obviously, your story today resonates with me, having had some, as we talked about before we started recording, some shared experiences with living in Texas, with running, and certainly a journey in our relationship with alcohol, and so many other things that I think folks are really going to be able to relate to. So I appreciate you sharing your story with us today. I look forward to following your journey ahead, and I wish you the best of weekends ahead as well.
Thank you so much.
What an honor it is for me to witness these powerful stories. I hope you feel the same way too. Think about what you learned from this conversation. What stood out for you? What challenged you? What inspired you? And I encourage you to write it down in some form of journaling and reflection. Surprises can reveal themselves to you when you do this. And if you were moved by today's conversation, pass it along to someone you care about. Let's spread the word. Let's continue to build connection. And if you do discover something you'd like to unpack further, book a call with me and let's talk about it. My links are in the show notes. Be sure to like this episode, follow the podcast here on this platform and social media at Off the Comma, and feel free to comment and interact with these posts and episodes. Check out my website for workshops, events, and my sponsor community. I'm covering the costs of production by curating my own sponsors who align with our vision. Be sure to check them out. They're all powerful people and businesses. Thank you for listening to this episode of Off the Comma. As always, keep noticing and keep listening.